The moment the world finally sees her is the moment he realizes he never did. The camera flashes didn't pause, not for breath, not for space, not even for dignity. They burst in rapid succession like white lightning against the polished marble floors of the Manhattan Conference Hall, each flicker catching a different angle of the same truth. Ava Brooks standing at the center of it all, poised, composed, her posture straight but not rigid, her chin lifted just enough to meet the lights without flinching, and beside her, a small hand wrapped around hers, steady, unafraid. As if this was not overwhelming at all, as if this world of headlines and cameras and whispered admiration had always belonged to them. Her son shifting slightly closer, his blazer just a bit too new, the sleeve still holding that crisp fold from the store, his eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity, unaware of how many people had stopped mid-conversation to stare, not because of her, not entirely, but because of him, because of the way his face carried a familiarity no one could quite place out loud yet. And the reporter's voice cut through the noise, warm but eager. "Ava, over here please, just one more. Tell us how it feels to be named one of Forbes' top innovators under 40. And she turned slightly, not rushed, not rehearsed, just precise, like every movement had been learned through years of being unseen. And now that she was seen, she refused to waste a single second of it. Her voice calm when she answered. "It feels earned." And nothing more. No long explanation, no overstatement. Just those two words that settled heavier than any speech ever could. Because the truth didn't need decoration. It never had. And somewhere miles away, in an office lined with glass and steel, and the quiet hum of a city that never really stopped moving, Ethan Cole paused mid-step, his reflection caught in the darkened edge of a screen before he even realized why he had stopped. The headline glowing back at him in bold black letters. Ava Brooks, the woman who built an empire from nothing, and his hand, the same hand that had signed contracts worth millions without hesitation, tightened slightly around the tablet, his thumb hovering just above the screen, as if touching it would make it more real than it already was. His eyes scanning the image again, not the text, not the accolades, but her, the woman he used to know, or at least the version of her he thought he understood, except this woman didn't match that memory at all. Not the quiet assistant who used to stand just a step behind him in meetings. Not the one who nodded when spoken to and rarely spoke first. Not the one he had dismissed with a laugh so casual he barely remembered it happening. But he remembered now, not because he wanted to, but because the image forced him to, the sound of his own voice echoing faintly in the back of his mind. Light, dismissive, almost amused. "You're not built for this world, Ava." And the way he had leaned back in his chair when he said it, confident, certain, unaware that those words would become the foundation she would eventually rise from. And his gaze shifted slightly, almost unconsciously, to the boy standing beside her. The angle of the child's jaw, the shape of his eyes, something about it pulling at a recognition he couldn't immediately place, something familiar in a way that made his chest tighten just enough to notice. And he frowned, not in confusion, but in resistance, as if his mind was trying to connect a pattern he wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. And he exhaled slowly, setting the tablet down on his desk, but not fully letting go of it, his fingers still resting on the edge, grounding himself in something solid while the rest of the moment felt anything but. And across the city, the flashes continued, the applause rising and falling in waves as Ava stepped slightly forward, guiding her son gently beside her, not shielding him, not hiding him, just including him, as if he had always been part of this story, because he had, even when no one else knew it, even when she had carried that truth alone through nights that felt longer than they should have been, through days measured not in hours but in effort, in survival, in quiet determination that no one clapped for. And the cameras didn't capture those years, they never did. They only captured this, the result, the outcome, the version of her that had already proven everything without needing to explain how. And as she moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations with a nod, a small smile, nothing excessive, nothing performative, her son's hand never left hers, and he looked up at her once, just briefly, his voice low but clear. "Mom, are we going home after this?" And she glanced down at him, her expression softening in a way the cameras didn't quite catch. "Yeah, baby, We are. And that word, simple, familiar, grounded, stood in quiet contrast to everything around them. Because no matter how far she had come, no matter how many headlines carried her name now, that was still the center of it all, not the empire, not the recognition, but the life she had built in the spaces no one had seen. And back in that office, Ethan finally picked up the tablet again, this time not hesitating, his eyes locking onto the image once more. And the more he looked, the clearer it became, not just her transformation, not just the success, but the absence of him in it, the complete, undeniable absence, as if the story had moved forward without ever needing to circle back. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, heavier than the recognition, heavier than the faint, growing suspicion about the boy, heavier even than the memory of that laugh he could no longer pretend didn't matter, because for the first time, it wasn't just a moment from the past. It was a line he couldn't cross back over, a point where everything had shifted, and he hadn't even noticed when it happened. And as the screen dimmed slightly in his hand, reflecting his own face back at him, the truth sat there, quiet but unmovable. She had built a life that didn't include him, and the world was finally paying attention to it. The article did not disappear from his screen when the meeting started. It lingered in the corner of his mind like a quiet interruption he could not silence. Even as voices filled the boardroom and numbers moved across polished glass displays, Ethan Cole sat at the head of the table with the same composed posture he had carried for years, shoulders squared, expression controlled, the image of a man who did not get distracted. But his attention kept slipping, not to the projections or the quarterly forecasts, but to the still frame burned into his memory. Ava is standing under those lights, calm, unshaken, as if the world had finally adjusted to her instead of the other way around. And beside her, that boy, the detail he could not ignore no matter how many times he told himself it meant nothing. His assistant's voice cut through. "Sir, the acquisition timeline." And Ethan blinked once, slow, deliberate, forcing his focus back into the room. "Continue," he said, his tone steady, practiced, but his fingers tapped once against the table. A small movement that did not go unnoticed by those who had worked with him long enough to recognize when something was off. The meeting moved forward. Decisions were made, signatures implied, but none of it settled the quiet pressure building behind his ribs, because logic could not override what instinct had already begun to question. And when the room finally cleared, the silence that followed felt heavier than usual, the kind that did not belong to an empty space but to a thought left unresolved. He stood slowly, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, the same skyline he had once believed he controlled. Every deal, every move, every outcome calculated. But this was not something he had planned for. And he picked up his phone this time instead of the tablet, pulling up the article again, not scanning it quickly like before, but reading it line by line, as if the details might shift if he looked closely enough. Ava Brooks, founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Initiative, a company built on strategic consulting and community investment, revenue exceeding 8 figures within 3 years, recognized for reshaping urban development models across multiple states. The words were clear, direct, undeniable, and nowhere in that story was there a mention of how it started. Nowhere did it trace back to the version of her he remembered, the one who used to stand in his office doorway waiting for direction, the one who had once asked him, carefully, almost hesitantly, "What if I wanted to build something of my own?" And he had laughed, not loudly, not cruelly in his mind at the time, just a short breath of amusement, a dismissal wrapped in what he had believed was honesty. "You are good where you are, Ava," he had said, not even looking up fully from his screen. "Not everyone is meant to lead." And he had moved on from that moment without thinking twice, because to him it had not been a defining moment, just another conversation in a day filled with them. But now, standing alone in that office, it returned with a weight he had not assigned to it back then, and his gaze shifted again to the image attached to the article, his thumb zooming in slightly this time, focusing not on her, but on the boy, the way the child stood with a quiet confidence that did not seem taught but natural, the way his eyes held a familiar sharpness, the same slight narrowing. When looking at something with focus, and Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in recognition that refused to fully form into acceptance, he exhaled through his nose, stepping back from the window, pacing once across the room, a rare break in his usual stillness, and he told himself it was coincidence, that resemblance happened, that the mind filled gaps when it wanted answers, but the thought did not leave. It stayed, persistent, like a question waiting to be asked out loud, and he stopped again, this time at his desk, pressing a button lightly. "Marcus," he said when the line connected, his voice measured, "pull everything you can on Brooks' initiative. I want a full profile, background, timelines, partnerships, everything." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Yes, sir," and the call ended, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his hand resting against the edge of the desk, not because he needed support, but because he needed something to anchor him while the narrative in his head began to shift, because this was no longer just about a former employee who had succeeded. It was about a gap in his own understanding, a part of the story he had not been present for, and that absence now felt significant in a way he could not ignore. And across town, the event had begun to thin, the energy settling into something quieter as guests moved toward exits, conversations softening. But Ava did not rush. She never did anymore. She had learned the pace of her own life did not need to match the urgency of others. She adjusted the strap of her son's backpack slightly, her hand brushing his shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and routine, and he looked up at her again. "Did I do okay?" he asked, his voice small but steady, and she smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to let him know the answer before she even spoke. "You did perfect," she said, and he nodded, satisfied, because he trusted her words without needing anything more, and they walked toward the exit together, not as people leaving something behind, but as people who had already taken what mattered with them. The night air outside was cooler, the kind that settled against the skin and reminded you that the world was larger than any room, any headline, any moment, and Ava paused briefly on the steps, not for attention, not for reflection, just to take a breath that belonged only to her, and for a second, the city noise faded into the background, replaced by something quieter, something internal, a memory she did not revisit often, not because it hurt too much, but because it no longer needed to define her. The echo of that office years ago, the way she had stood there holding on to an idea that had not yet taken shape, the way his laughter had filled the space just enough to make it clear where she stood in his world, and the way she had walked out later, not in anger, not in protest, but in understanding that sometimes the clearest answer was the one you were not meant to argue with. Just accept and move beyond. And she reached for her son's hand again as they stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the rhythm of the city, not because they were unnoticed, but because they did not need to stand out anymore. They already had, and miles away, in a building that overlooked the same skyline from a different angle, Ethan remained still, the file he had requested already beginning to compile somewhere in the system, data moving, connections forming, but for the first time in a long time, he was not entirely certain what he was looking for, only that whatever it was, it had already changed something, and he could feel it, even before he understood it. The file arrived faster than he expected, not because it was simple, but because people like him did not ask twice, and when they did ask, systems moved, timelines shortened, information surfaced whether it wanted to or not, and Ethan stood behind his desk when the notification appeared, not sitting, not relaxed, his posture carrying that same controlled tension he had held since the moment the image first caught his attention. His fingers moved once across the screen, opening the report Marcus had compiled, and for a brief second, before he even read the first line, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not fear, not uncertainty, but anticipation mixed with resistance. Like a part of him already knew this was not going to confirm what he wanted it to confirm, and the first page loaded clean, structured, efficient. Ava Brooks, founder and chief executive officer. Brooks Initiative established 5 years ago. Primary focus urban redevelopment consulting, strategic partnerships with mid to large-scale firms. Growth rate exceeding industry averages within the first 18 months. And he read each line slower than usual, not skimming, not jumping ahead, but absorbing it piece by piece, as if understanding her present required him to reconstruct the parts of her past he had never paid attention to. and his jaw tightened slightly when the timeline aligned. 5 years, the number repeating in his mind with quiet precision, because 5 years ago was not just a random point in time. It was the year she disappeared, not dramatically, not publicly, just gone. One day she was there. The next her office was cleared, her email inactive, her presence erased from the daily rhythm of his company like it had never existed. And he remembered asking once, briefly, where did Ava go? Not because he was concerned, but because he noticed the absence in workflow, and someone had responded, "She resigned, sir." And he had nodded, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. Because people left, that was normal, expected, replaceable. And now, reading this, that same moment returned with a weight it had never carried before, and he scrolled further. The report detailing early stages of her company. Limited capital, no initial investors, first. Contracts secured through independent consulting. And he paused there, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in disbelief, but in calculation, because he knew exactly how difficult that was. He understood the barriers, the closed doors, the skepticism, the rejection that came with trying to build something without backing. And yet she had done it. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily, and he exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to create space between himself and the screen, but not enough to disconnect from it. And then the next section appeared. Personal details minimal, intentionally limited, no public records indicating marital status, no partner listed, one dependent, male, age 4, and his breath caught. Not visibly, not dramatically, but just enough that he noticed the shift, the numbers settling into place with the rest of the timeline, 4 years old. And his mind did not rush this time. It did not jump to conclusions. It moved carefully, deliberately, aligning dates, calculating backward, placing events where they belonged whether he wanted them there or not. And he looked at the image again, not the one from the article, but the one embedded in the report, taken at a smaller event months earlier, less formal, less staged. Ava standing beside that same child, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and the resemblance did not feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like something he had ignored long enough for it to become undeniable. And he stood abruptly, not out of panic, but out of the need to move, to break the stillness that had begun to feel too heavy, pacing once across the office, then stopping again, his hand running briefly along his jaw. A gesture he had not made in years, not since a time when he allowed himself to process things he could not immediately control. And he spoke again, pressing the intercom. "Marcus, give me everything on her personal timeline, before the company, where she lived, what she did after she left here." His voice steady, but lower now, more focused, and there was a hesitation this time before Marcus responded. "Yes, sir, I will expand the search." And the line clicked off, and Ethan stood there, the city stretching beyond the glass behind him. But for once, he was not looking at it. He was looking inward, at a gap in his own story that had just become impossible to ignore. And miles away, in a quieter part of the city where the streets were narrower and the buildings carried less shine but more history, Ava unlocked the door to her home, the soft click of the lock sliding open blending into the familiar rhythm of her evening. Her son stepping inside first, dropping his small backpack by the entryway without being told, his shoes kicked off in a way that was slightly messy but consistent. And she followed, closing the door behind them with a gentle push, the space inside warm, not in temperature alone, but in the kind of presence that did not need to prove anything to anyone outside of it. And he moved toward the kitchen, climbing onto a stool with practiced ease. "Can I have apple slices?" he asked, and she smiled faintly, setting her bag down before reaching for the cutting board. "You already know the answer," she said, and he grinned, because routines like this were the kind of certainty he relied on, the kind that did not change even when everything else did. And as she sliced the apple carefully, evenly, her movements precise but unhurried, her mind drifted briefly, not to the event, not to the cameras or the recognition, but to something quieter, something older, a memory that did not carry pain anymore, just clarity, the small apartment she had once lived in, the nights when sleep came in pieces instead of hours, the sound of her son breathing beside her as an infant, steady and fragile at the same time, the way she had learned to build a life not in leaps, but in steps so small no one else would have called them progress. and she placed the slices in front of him, watching as he took the first bite. Content, present, unaware of the weight of the story he was part of, and she rested her hand lightly against the counter, grounding herself in the simplicity of the moment, because this was the part that mattered, not the headlines, not the recognition, but the life she had built in the spaces no one had documented. And across the city, Ethan returned to his desk, the report still open, the details no longer just information, but pieces of something larger, something that was no longer abstract. And he stared at the line again. One dependent, male, age 4. And for the first time, the question formed fully, not as a thought he could push aside, but as something that demanded to be faced, not later, not eventually, but now. And the silence in the room felt different this time, not empty, not neutral, but charged with the kind of realization that changes everything before a single word is spoken. The answer did not come to him all at once. It did not arrive with certainty or clarity. It unfolded slowly, like a realization that had been waiting for permission to exist, and Ethan remained standing behind his desk long after the office had emptied, the city outside shifting from late afternoon brightness into the muted glow of evening lights, the reflection in the glass changing with it, his own figure becoming more defined against the darkening skyline. And he did not move to turn on the overhead lights. He did not reach for another file or distraction. He let the silence settle, because for the first time in years, silence was not something he needed to fill. It was something he needed to hear, and his eyes drifted once more to the report, the line that refused to fade. One dependent, male, age 4. And this time he did not look away from it. He did not try to reinterpret it. He let it sit exactly as it was, because the timeline had already aligned. The memory had already surfaced, and the resemblance had already spoken louder than any confirmation could. And his voice, when he finally spoke again, was quieter than before, not directed at anyone else, just a low statement to himself. For years, and the number carried more weight than it should have, because it was no longer just a detail. It was a measure of absence, of everything he had not seen, not known, not even considered. And he closed his eyes briefly, not out of weakness, but out of calculation, as if shutting out the visual might allow him to organize the internal. But the moment he did, the past did not stay out. It came forward, clearer than it had been in years. The last day, he saw her not as a blur, but as a sequence, her standing near the doorway of his office, holding a folder that she had prepared, her posture steady, her voice measured when she spoke. I wanted to go over this proposal. And he had barely glanced up. His attention split between emails and a call he was about to take. Leave it on the desk, he had said, already. Moving on, already assuming there would be another time, another moment, another opportunity to engage, because in his world, things did not end without notice. They transitioned, they adjusted, they remained within reach, and yet that had been the last real conversation they had, because the next day, she was gone. Not abruptly in the way people made a scene, not dramatically in the way that demanded attention, but completely, quietly, and he had not followed that absence. He had not questioned it beyond its immediate impact on workflow. And now, standing here years later, that silence from her felt louder than anything she could have said back then, and he opened his eyes again, the present returning with a sharp clarity, and he moved toward his chair, sitting for the first time since the file arrived, his hands resting on the desk, fingers interlocked loosely, a posture that suggested control but held something else beneath it, something he was still trying to define, and he pressed the intercom once more. Marcus, I need confirmation on something specific, he said, his tone even, but the intent behind it unmistakable. Cross-reference the timeline, her resignation date, any medical records that align within that period, anything that would indicate a change in her personal status. There was a longer pause this time, not because Marcus did not understand, but because he did, and the weight of that understanding slowed his response just enough to be noticeable. I will prioritize it, he said, and the line disconnected, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting upward, not to the ceiling, but to a point just beyond it, as if looking through layers of time rather than space. And for the first time, the question was no longer abstract, it was direct, unavoidable. And it did not come with anger or accusation. It came with something more complicated, something quieter, a recognition of what had been missed, and across the city, Ava moved through her evening with the same steady rhythm she had built over the years, her son finishing his snack, his small voice filling the space with questions that did not require perfect answers. "Do I have school tomorrow?" he asked, swinging his legs slightly from the stool, and she nodded, rinsing the knife under warm water. "You do. And you have reading time first." And he groaned lightly, not out of real frustration, but out of habit. "Can you read with me?" And she turned, leaning lightly against the counter. "I always do," she said, and he smiled, satisfied with the consistency, because consistency was what had shaped his world, not sudden changes, not dramatic shifts, but the quiet reliability of her presence. And as she dried her hands and walked over to him, guiding him gently toward the living room, her mind did not return to the event, not to the recognition or the attention. It stayed anchored in this space, this life, because this was where her decisions had always been made, not in response to the past, but in commitment to the future she was building. And as they settled onto the couch, a book opening between them, his small finger tracing the lines as he followed along, her voice steady, calm, carrying the story forward one word at a time, she did not think about who might be looking for her, who might be connecting the pieces she had chosen not to present, because she had already made peace with what she had kept and what she had left unsaid. And miles away, Ethan remained in that office, the city now fully illuminated outside, each light a reminder of the scale of the world he had always operated in. And yet, for the first time, that scale felt incomplete, because there was a part of the story that existed entirely outside of his reach, and he was only now beginning to understand that it had never needed him to exist at all. And when the next report notification appeared, smaller, more specific, he did not hesitate this time. He opened it immediately, his eyes scanning quickly until they found what they were looking for, a single line that did not confirm everything, but confirmed enough. Medical appointment logged within weeks of her resignation. Follow-up visits consistent over the following months. And he exhaled slowly, not sharply, not dramatically, just a controlled release of breath that acknowledged what his mind had already accepted. And he leaned back further into his chair, the truth settling into place not as a shock, but as a quiet, irreversible shift. And for the first time, the question was no longer if, it was what now, and the answer to that was not something he could calculate the way he had calculated everything else in his life, because this was not a deal, not a strategy, not a negotiation. This was something that had moved forward without him, grown without him, and now stood fully formed in front of him, whether he chose to face it or not. The truth did not explode into his life. It settled, slowly and completely, like something that had always been there, but had only now been acknowledged. And Ethan remained seated long after the confirmation appeared on his screen, the glow of the monitor reflecting faintly against his face while the rest of the office dimmed into shadow, the city outside still alive, still moving, but distant in a way it had never felt before. Because for the first time, his focus was not outward, it was inward, tracing back through moments he had once dismissed as insignificant, now realizing that those were the very moments that had defined everything he was facing now. And his hand moved once across the desk, not to reach for anything specific, but to ground himself in the present while his mind continued to reconstruct the past, the last few weeks before she left, the way she had been quieter, not withdrawn, not distracted, just more deliberate. Her work still precise, her presence still professional. But there had been something else, something he had not taken the time to read correctly, and now, those details returned with clarity he had not earned back then. The slight pause before she spoke in meetings, the way her hand would rest briefly against the edge of the table as if steadying herself, the one time she had asked to leave early, not with explanation, just a simple request that he had approved without looking up, because it had not mattered to him at the time. And now, each of those moments rearranged themselves into something undeniable, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. And he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the desk, his fingers pressing together as his gaze lowered, not at the screen anymore, but at the space just in front of him, as if the answers might be written there if he looked long enough. And for the first time, a question surfaced that he had never asked before, not about her, not about the situation, but about himself, about the way he had moved through people, through relationships, through lives that intersected with his own, always assuming that what did not demand his attention did not require it. And he exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the stillness of the room, because this was not a realization that came with immediate resolution. It came with recognition, and recognition did not offer comfort. It offered clarity, and clarity had a weight of its own. And he reached for his phone again, not out of impulse this time, but with intention, scrolling back to the article once more, not to read it again, but to look at her, to study the version of Ava Brooks that existed now. The woman who stood in front of cameras without needing to prove anything to them. The woman who spoke in short, measured answers because she no longer needed to explain herself. And the more he looked, the more he understood that this version of her had not been created in reaction to him. It had been built independently, shaped by choices he had not been part of, decisions he had not influenced, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant that whatever connection existed between them now was not something he could control, not something he could define. And for a man who had built his entire life on control, that was the part he could not immediately reconcile. And across the city, Ava sat beside her son as he turned the page of the book, his voice soft but focused as he read aloud, stumbling slightly over longer words but correcting himself with quiet determination. And she listened, not interrupting, not rushing him, just present, her hand resting lightly against his back, a steady reassurance that he did not need to look up to confirm. And when he finished the page, he glanced at her, waiting, and she nodded once, a small smile forming. "You are getting faster," she said, and his face brightened, not because of the praise itself, but because it came from her, and that made it real, and he leaned back slightly, closing the book halfway. "Did you always know how to do everything?" he asked suddenly, his question simple, but layered in the way only children's questions could be, and Ava paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the weight behind what he was really asking, and she shook her head gently. "No, I learned," she said, her voice calm, steady. "I learned one thing at a time," and he considered that, his brows drawing together slightly as he processed it. "So I can learn anything?" he asked, and she nodded again, this time with more certainty. "You can learn anything you are willing to work for." And he smiled, satisfied with that answer, because it fit into the world he understood, a world where effort connected to outcome, where progress came from consistency. And she reached over, brushing a curl away from his forehead, her touch light, familiar, and in that moment, there was no trace of the life she had left behind, no shadow of the office where she had once stood, waiting to be seen, because that version of her no longer needed to be acknowledged. She had already moved beyond it. And miles away, Ethan stood again, unable to remain seated any longer, the energy in his body shifting from stillness into motion, not frantic, not uncontrolled, but purposeful. And he walked back toward the window, his reflection now fully visible against the glass, the outline of a man who had everything he had once set out to achieve, and yet now stood facing something he had never planned for. And he studied that reflection for a moment, not with pride, not with criticism, just observation, as if trying to understand how the same person who had built an empire could have missed something so significant without ever realizing it. And his jaw set slightly, not in resistance, but in decision, because this was no longer something he could leave unresolved, not because it disrupted his life, but because it revealed something about it that he could not ignore. And he turned from the window, his steps measured as he moved back toward his desk, reaching for his phone once more. But this time, he did not scroll, he did not read, he dialed, his assistant answering on the second ring. "Yes, sir." And his voice, when he spoke, carried a clarity it had not held before. "Set a meeting," he said, pausing just long enough to choose the next words with precision. "With Ava Brooks." And there was a brief silence on the other end, not confusion, but recognition of the weight behind the request. "Yes, sir, I will arrange it." And the call ended, and Ethan lowered the phone slowly, placing it back on the desk with deliberate care, because this was not just another meeting, not just another item on his schedule. It was the first step into a conversation that had been waiting for years, and for the first time, he was not certain how it would unfold, and that uncertainty did not weaken him. It grounded him, because some outcomes could not be predicted, only faced, and across the city. Ava closed the book gently, her son already leaning against her side, his eyes growing heavy as the day settled into night, and she adjusted slightly, letting him rest comfortably, her hand moving in slow, absent circles against his back, and the room grew quieter. The kind of quiet that held peace instead of tension, and she did not know that a call had just been made, that a decision had just been set into motion, and even if she had, it would not have changed the way she sat there, steady, present, certain of the life she had built and the boundaries she had chosen, because whatever came next would not redefine her. It would only reveal whether the past had finally caught up to the truth she had been living all along. The morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with structure, the kind that had defined Ava's life long before anyone outside her world had begun to notice it. The soft light filtering through the window, the quiet rhythm of movement in a home where nothing needed to be rushed to be meaningful, and she moved through it with the same steady presence she carried everywhere else, her son already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book open in front of him, not reading yet, just flipping through pages, absorbing the colors and shapes in his own way. And she paused for a moment in the doorway, watching him, not because there was anything extraordinary about the moment, but because there was something complete about it, something that did not require improvement or adjustment, just acknowledgement. And he looked up when he sensed her there, his face lighting with a familiarity that had never needed to be earned. "Are we late?" he asked, and she shook her head, stepping fully into the room. "We are right on time," she said, and he nodded, satisfied, because in his world, time was not measured by clocks alone. It was measured by consistency, by the fact that she always showed up when she said she would. And across the city, Ethan's morning looked different. Not in structure, but in intention, the routine still in place, the schedule still precise. But there was a shift beneath it, subtle, controlled, but present. And as he stepped into his office, his assistant was already waiting, tablet in hand. "The meeting has been scheduled," she said, her voice professional, neutral, but there was a slight awareness behind it. The understanding that this was not just another entry on his calendar. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., her office confirmed, and Ethan nodded. Once, not asking for adjustments, not questioning the timing. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to control the variables, he was stepping into them. And he moved past her into his office, setting his things down with the same measured precision. But his gaze lingered on the empty space in front of him for a second longer than usual, as if acknowledging the weight of what was coming. And he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not signal hesitation, but preparation, and the rest of the morning moved forward, meetings, calls, decisions. But each one felt slightly different, not because the stakes had changed, but because his focus had. And when his attention drifted, it did not drift to numbers or projections, it drifted to that image again, not just of Ava, but of the life she had built without him, the life he was about to step into without knowing his place in it. And miles away, Ava moved through her own workday with the same calm. Efficiency that had defined her rise, her office not grand in the way his was, but intentional, every detail serving a purpose, the glass walls allowing light to move freely through the space, the shelves lined with materials that reflected not just success, but process. And she sat at her desk reviewing a proposal, her attention fully present, because this was where she operated best, not in reaction, but in creation. And her phone buzzed once against the surface beside her, a notification she did not immediately reach for, because urgency no longer dictated her responses. But when she did glance at it, her eyes paused for just a fraction of a second longer than usual. The name displayed clear, direct, not hidden behind a number or a vague identifier. Cole Enterprises, meeting confirmation, and she did not react outwardly. She did not tense, did not shift in her seat, but something in her stillness deepened, not resistance, not surprise, just recognition, because some moments did not need explanation. They simply arrived when they were meant to, and she set the phone back down without opening the message further, her gaze returning to the document in front of her, because whatever was coming next did not change what needed to be done now. And that had always been her strength, the ability to remain grounded in the present even when the past tried to reintroduce itself. And later that afternoon, she stood in the hallway outside her son's classroom, waiting as the door opened and children began to spill out in small bursts of energy, voices overlapping, laughter filling the space. And he spotted her almost immediately, weaving through the movement with the same quiet certainty he carried everywhere else, his hand finding hers without hesitation. "You came early," he said, and she smiled faintly. "I always do." And he nodded, because that answer never changed. And as they walked toward the exit, his voice continued, filling the space between them with small observations about his day, the story he read, the question he answered, the friend he sat next to, and she listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, just present, because this was where her attention belonged. And as they stepped outside, the afternoon light softer now, the air carrying a calm that signaled the transition into evening. Her phone vibrated again in her bag, but she did not reach for it. Not yet, because she had learned that not every notification required immediate acknowledgement. And across the city, Ethan stood once more by his window, the skyline stretching out in front of him. The same view he had seen every day for years, but today, it felt different, not because the city had changed, but because his perspective had. And he rested his hands lightly in his pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that was unfamiliar but not uncomfortable, and his mind did not race ahead, did not try to script the conversation that was coming. It stayed present, focused, because this was not something that could be predicted or controlled, and for the first time, that realization did not frustrate him, it grounded him, because some conversations were not about outcomes, they were about truth. And as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the buildings, he allowed himself one final moment of stillness before the next day arrived. The day that would bring him face to face with a version of the past he had never fully understood. And across the city, Ava unlocked her door once more, her son stepping inside with the same easy rhythm, his voice already filling the space with questions about dinner, about tomorrow, about the small things that built their life together. And she moved with him, not ahead, not behind, just beside, because whatever was coming next, whatever conversation waited beyond the horizon of her day, it would meet her exactly where she stood, steady, prepared, and no longer defined by anything she had already overcome. The next morning did not rush him. It met him, steady and exact, as if the day itself understood the weight it carried. And Ethan arrived earlier than usual, not because he needed the extra time, but because he did not want to arrive late to something he could not afford to misstep. His driver pulling up to the building that housed Brooks' initiative with the same smooth precision that had defined every arrival in his life. But this time, the moment before he stepped out lingered just a second longer, his hand resting on the door handle, his reflection faintly visible in the tinted glass. And for a brief second, he allowed himself to see it clearly, not the title, not the position, just the man who had once believed he understood the value of everything around him. And then he stepped out, the city air crisp, the morning light still soft enough to avoid harshness, and he walked toward the entrance without hesitation, his pace measured, his posture unchanged, but there was a difference in the way he carried himself, not heavier, not uncertain, just aware. And inside, the lobby was quiet, modern but not excessive, designed with intention rather than display. And he noticed that immediately, not as a critique, but as an observation, because this space reflected her, not him, not the world he had built, but the one she had created on her own terms. And the receptionist greeted him with a calm professionalism that did not shift when she recognized his name. "Good morning, Mr. Cole, she is expecting you." And he nodded once, not offering more than necessary, because this was not a place where his name carried the same weight it did elsewhere. And that realization did not unsettle him. It grounded him further, and he was directed toward a glass-enclosed conference room at the end of the hallway. The walk there quiet, each step echoing softly against the polished floor, and when he reached the door, he paused, not because he needed to gather himself, but because he understood that what waited on the other side was not just a conversation, it was a moment that would redefine something he had only just begun to understand. And then he opened it. And she was already there, not standing, not preparing, just seated at the table, reviewing something on a tablet, her posture relaxed but attentive. And when she looked up, her expression did not change. No surprise, no tension, just acknowledgement. "Ethan," she said, her voice even, steady. And the sound of his name in her voice carried none of the past he remembered. No hesitation, no softness, just clarity. And he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "Ava," he replied, and for a moment, the room held nothing but that exchange. Two names, two people, and everything that existed between them unspoken but fully present. And he moved toward the chair across from her, sitting without rushing, his movements controlled, but not rigid, and for the first time in a long time. He did not begin with a statement. He did not lead the conversation. He allowed the silence to exist, because he understood that this was not a space he could command the way he had commanded others. And she set the tablet down slowly, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady, not challenging, not inviting, just present. And when she spoke, it was direct. "You asked for this meeting." And he nodded once. "I did." And there was no immediate follow-up, no justification, because he knew that anything he said next needed to be intentional, not reactive. And he leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, a subtle shift that signaled engagement without imposing. "There are things I need to understand," he said, his voice measured, but quieter than it had been in the boardrooms he was used to. And she did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she did not rush her answers anymore. She considered them, weighed them, chose them, and when she did speak, her tone did not change. "Understanding is different from needing answers," she said, and he held her gaze, absorbing the distinction, because she was right, and that was not something he would have acknowledged years ago, and he nodded slightly. "Then I need answers," he said, correcting himself without defensiveness. And something in her expression shifted, not visibly, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough to mark that he had adjusted, that he was not approaching this the same way he would have before. And she leaned back slightly in her chair, creating just enough space to redefine the dynamic. "Ask," she said, and the simplicity of that word carried more weight than any extended response could have, and he did not hesitate this time. "The timeline," he said, his voice steady. "You left 5 years ago," and she nodded once. "I did," and he continued, not rushing, but not circling the point either. "Your son," he paused just long enough to ensure the next words were deliberate. "He is 4. And the room did not react. There was no shift in energy, no tension added, because the truth did not need dramatics. It already held its own weight, and she did not look away, did not break the connection. "Yes," she said, and he exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in confirmation, but in acknowledgement, because the answer he had already reached internally had now been spoken aloud. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence returning, but it was no longer empty. It was full, carrying everything that had led to this point, and he leaned back slightly, his hands coming together loosely, not as a barrier, but as a point of focus. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and his tone was not accusatory, not sharp, just direct. And she tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration of how to answer, and when she did, her voice remained steady, unchanged. "Because you were not someone I could build that life with," she said, and the words did not come with anger, did not carry bitterness. They were simply stated, as if they had been understood long before this moment, and he absorbed that, not reacting immediately, because there was nothing to argue against, nothing to correct, and he nodded slowly, the movement small but real. "And now," he began, but stopped, not because he did not know what he wanted to ask, but because he understood that the question itself needed to be considered. And she watched him, not with impatience, not with expectation, just with the same calm presence she had carried from the moment he walked in. And for the first time, he realized that this conversation was not about reclaiming anything. It was about facing what had already been built without him. And as that understanding settled, his next words came differently, not from position, but from recognition. "And now I am here," he said, and she nodded once. "You are." And the simplicity of that exchange carried more truth than anything else that had been said, because it defined exactly where they stood, not in the past, not in what could have been, but in what was. And outside the glass walls, the office continued to move, people passing, conversations happening, the world continuing as it always did. But inside that room, time held its place, not rushing forward, not pulling back, just allowing the truth to exist between them, clear, steady, and no longer avoidable. The silence after her answer did not break. It expanded, stretching across the space between them in a way that felt deliberate, as if neither of them was willing to rush past what had just been said, and Ethan remained still, his gaze steady on her, not searching for weakness, not trying to reinterpret her words, but accepting them as they were, because for the first time, he understood that her clarity was not something he could negotiate with, and Ava did not look away, did not shift in her seat, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that made the room feel smaller, not physically, but in focus, because everything that mattered was already contained within it. And after a moment, she spoke again, not to fill the silence, but to define it. "You are not here because of the past," she said, her voice calm. "Even, you are here because the present made itself visible," and he absorbed that. The distinction settling in with quiet precision, because she was not wrong. He had not gone looking for her, not out of concern, not out of unfinished emotion. He had been led here by what he saw, by what could no longer be ignored, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that. "And the present includes him," he said, his tone measured, not claiming, not assuming, just stating what now existed between them, and her gaze did not waver. "The present includes everything I chose to build," she replied, and the emphasis was subtle, but clear, because this was not about inclusion by default, it was about inclusion by decision, and he leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, not tapping, not moving, just there, anchoring him in the moment. "I am not here to disrupt that," he said, and the words came without hesitation, because he understood that any attempt to impose himself into her life would be rejected before it even began, and she studied him for a second longer, not questioning the statement, but measuring it, and then she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not grant permission, but recognized intent, and the room shifted again, not in tension, but in direction, because the conversation was no longer about confirmation, it was about consequence, and Ethan's gaze lowered briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration, because the next question he asked would define where this went. And when he looked back up, his voice carried a different tone, still controlled, but more grounded. "Does he know?" he asked, and Ava's expression softened. Slightly, not in vulnerability, but in depth, because this was no longer about him. It was about her son, and she shook her head gently. "He knows what matters," she said, and he held that answer for a moment, understanding what it meant without needing her to elaborate, because a child did not need to know everything to be secure, to be loved, to be whole, and he nodded once, accepting that boundary without challenge. And for a moment, the room felt still again, not stagnant, but balanced. Both of them aware that the conversation had reached a point where it could not return to anything simpler, and Ava shifted slightly in her chair, not away from him, but into a more settled position, her hands resting loosely in her lap, now, instead of on the table, a subtle signal that she was no longer in a defensive posture. Because she did not need to be, and she spoke again, this time not answering a question, but offering a truth of her own. "You laughed at me once," she said, her voice unchanged, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not deny it, because he remembered, not just the moment, but the weight it carried now, and he nodded slowly. "I did," he said, and there was no justification, no explanation attached, because he understood that none of that would change what it had been, and she continued. "That moment did not break me," she said, her gaze steady. It clarified everything, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, because they did not ask for a response, they did not seek validation, they simply existed as the foundation of everything that had followed, and Ethan felt that, not as a blow, but as a shift, because he was no longer looking at the consequences of his actions from his own perspective. He was seeing them through the life she had built afterward, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to release the tension he had been holding since he walked into the room. "I see that now," he said, and the statement was simple, but it carried more weight than any apology could have at that moment. because it acknowledged her reality without trying to reshape it, and Ava nodded once, not in acceptance, not in agreement, but in recognition that he had reached that understanding on his own, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence returning again, but this time it felt different, not heavy, not unresolved, but complete in its own way, and outside the glass walls, the movement of the office continued, people passing by, voices low, the world functioning as it always did, unaware of the shift happening inside that room, and Ethan glanced toward the window briefly, not to escape the moment, but to ground himself in something familiar before returning his attention to her, because this was not a conversation he wanted to rush through, and when he looked back, his expression had changed slightly, not softened, but clarified. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and the question was not loaded, not strategic, it was direct, because for the first time, he was not approaching this as something to solve, but as something to understand, and Ava did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she chose her words carefully, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady, unwavering. "Nothing," she said, and the simplicity of that answer landed with more force than anything else that had been said, because it removed expectation entirely, it removed obligation. It removed the assumption that he had a role to play in something that had already been built without him, and Ethan held that answer, not reacting outwardly, but feeling the weight of it settle into place, because he had spent his entire life being needed, being required, being the one people turned to, and now, in this moment, he was not needed at all, and that realization did not diminish him, it redefined him, and he nodded slowly, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Because this was the truth she had chosen, and he had no right to challenge it, and Ava watched him for a moment. Longer, not with judgment, not with expectation, just with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. And then she reached for her tablet again, not as a dismissal, but as a signal that the conversation had reached its natural pause, and the room shifted once more, not closing, but settling, because some conversations did not end with resolution. They ended with understanding, and as Ethan stood, his movements measured, controlled, he did not rush to leave, he did not extend the moment unnecessarily. He simply acknowledged it. "Thank you," he said, and the words were not formal, not habitual, they were intentional, and Ava nodded once. "Take care, Ethan," she replied, her voice steady, unchanged, and he turned, walking toward the door with the same composed stride he had entered with. But something in that movement had changed, not in appearance, but in weight, because he was no longer carrying assumptions. He was carrying truth, and as the door closed softly behind him, the space inside returned to its quiet rhythm, Ava's attention already shifting back to her work, her life continuing forward without interruption, while outside, Ethan stepped back into a world that now felt slightly different, not because it had changed, but because he had finally seen the part of it he had once overlooked. The hallway outside the conference room felt longer on the way out than it had on the way in, not because the distance had changed, but because the weight he carried through it had, and Ethan walked with the same composed stride, his shoulders aligned, his expression neutral, but beneath that control, something had shifted, something quieter than emotion but deeper than thought, a recognition that could not be undone, and the receptionist looked up briefly as he passed, offering a polite nod that he returned without breaking pace. Because this was not a moment that needed acknowledgement from anyone else. It was one he was still processing within himself, and when the doors opened to the street, the city greeted him with its usual rhythm, taxis moving, people crossing, conversations overlapping, the world continuing exactly as it had before he walked into that building. But for him, it felt altered, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but in a way that changed how he stood in it, and he paused for a fraction of a second at the curb, not hesitating, just taking in the air, the sound, the movement, as if recalibrating his place within it. And when his driver pulled up, he stepped in without speaking, the door closing with a soft, definitive sound that sealed the moment behind him, and the car moved forward, merging into traffic with ease. But his gaze did not follow the road. It stayed fixed ahead, unfocused, as his mind replayed the conversation, not searching for errors, not rewriting what had been said, but absorbing it exactly as it had happened. Her words clear, direct, unembellished, and the one that remained with him the most was not the confirmation, not even the truth about her son. It was the absence of expectation, the way she had looked at him and said she wanted nothing, and he leaned back slightly against the seat, his hand resting loosely against his thigh, fingers still, not tapping, not moving, because there was nothing to control in this moment, nothing to adjust, only something to understand. And for a man who had built his entire identity around being necessary, around being the solution, the absence of that role was unfamiliar, but it was not uncomfortable. It was clarifying, and he closed his eyes briefly, not to escape the moment, but to center himself within it, because the truth he had just faced did not require reaction. It required integration, and across the city, Ava remained exactly where she had been. Her focus returned fully to the document in front of her, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, because the conversation that had just taken place did not disrupt her. It confirmed something she had already known, something she had built her life around. And when her assistant knocked lightly on the glass, stepping in with a question about scheduling, Ava responded with the same calm precision she always carried, adjusting times, confirming details, moving forward without pause, because her life was not built around moments like that. It was built around consistency, around the quiet repetition of choices that aligned with who she had become. And later that afternoon, she stood once again outside her son's school, the same place, the same time, the same routine, and when he ran toward her, his small hand reaching for hers without hesitation, there was no trace of the conversation in her expression, no lingering tension, only presence, because she had learned long ago that the past only had power if you allowed it to interrupt the present, and she did not. And as they walked together, his voice filling the space with stories from his day, she listened, her attention fully with him, because that was where her priorities had always been. And miles away, Ethan's car came to a stop outside his office, the building rising above him in a way that had always symbolized achievement, control, success. And he stepped out, his posture returning to its familiar alignment, his presence once again commanding the space around him. But something in his gaze had changed, not softer, not uncertain, but more aware, and as he entered, his assistant approached immediately, tablet in hand, ready to brief him on the next meeting, the next decision, the next move. And he listened, nodding once, stepping into the rhythm of his world without hesitation, because that part of his life had not changed. But as he moved through the rest of his day, something remained beneath the surface, not distracting him, not pulling him away from his responsibilities, but existing alongside them. A quiet awareness that the life he had just stepped out of was not one he could step back into on his own terms. And when the day ended, and the office emptied, and the city outside shifted once again into evening, he found himself standing by the window, the same position, the same view, but not the same perspective, and his reflection looked back at him, unchanged in appearance, but altered in understanding. And for the first time, he did not see himself as the center of every outcome. He saw himself as someone who had been absent from something that had still managed to grow, to succeed, to thrive. And he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet in the empty room, because this realization did not demand action. It demanded acceptance, and acceptance was not something he had practiced often, but it was something he understood now. And across the city, Ava tucked her son into bed, his small voice already soft with sleep as he asked one last question. "Will you be here in the morning?" And she smiled, brushing a hand gently over his hair. "Always," she said, and he nodded, his eyes closing with the certainty that her words would hold. And as she turned off the light and stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her, she did not think about the meeting, did not revisit the conversation, because it had already taken its place in her story, not as a turning point, but as a confirmation, and her life continued forward, steady, grounded, untouched by anything that no longer belonged to it. While in another part of the city, Ethan stood in the quiet of his office, understanding for the first time that some things were not meant to be reclaimed, only recognized, and that recognition, though quiet, changed everything. The next day did not feel heavier. It felt clearer, as if something in him had settled overnight, not resolved, not erased, but placed exactly where it belonged, and Ethan moved through his morning with the same discipline that had defined every day before it, his schedule intact, his decisions precise, his presence unchanged to anyone watching. But internally, there was a shift, not emotional, not reactive, but structural. A recalibration of how he understood his place in a story that had continued without him. And as he sat at his desk reviewing documents, his focus did not fracture, it held, because he was not distracted, he was aware, and awareness did not weaken him, it refined him, and when his assistant entered with updates, he listened, responded, moved forward. But there was a difference in how he processed information now, a quiet filter that asked not just what mattered for business, but what mattered beyond it. And that question did not slow him down, it grounded him. And later that afternoon, when a call ended and the office fell briefly silent, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze shifting toward the window, the city stretching out in front of him in its usual complexity. And for the first time in years, he did not see it as something to conquer or control. He saw it as something that existed independently of him, just as her life had, and that recognition did not diminish his achievements, it contextualized them. And he exhaled slowly, his hand moving once across the desk, not to reach for anything, but to mark the transition from one understanding to another. And across the city, Ava's day followed its own rhythm, meetings, decisions, conversations that built forward instead of circling back, her presence in each one steady, intentional, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had shaped her company. And when she stepped out of her office later that day, her phone buzzed briefly in her hand, a message from her assistant confirming the next week's schedule, and she responded without hesitation, adjusting one detail, confirming another. Her focus always on what came next, not on what had already been addressed. And as she walked toward the elevator, her reflection caught in the glass for a moment, not as a point of vanity, but as a brief acknowledgement of the distance she had traveled, not measured in time alone, but in clarity, in the way she carried herself now compared to the version of her who had once stood in someone else's office waiting to be seen. And she did not linger on that thought. She let it pass, because she no longer needed to revisit who she had been to validate who she was. And when she arrived at her son's school, the routine unfolded as it always did, the door opening, children stepping out, voices filling the space, and he found her immediately, his hand reaching for hers with the same certainty that had always been there. "Did you work all day?" he asked, his tone curious, not concerned, and she nodded. "I did," and he smiled. "Are you tired?" And she shook her head slightly. "Not when I see you." And he accepted that answer without question, because in his world, her presence was constant, reliable, and that reliability had shaped everything he understood about love, about safety, about what it meant to belong. And as they walked home, his voice continued, filling the space with stories, questions, small observations that did not need to be extraordinary to matter, and she listened, responding when needed, letting silence exist when it did not, because she understood that connection was not built in grand moments. It was built in these, the consistent, quiet exchanges that formed the foundation of everything else. And miles away, Ethan's office began to empty as the day came to a close, his assistant stepping in once more with a final update. "Your evening is clear," she said, and he nodded, not adding anything to it, because for once, he did not feel the need to fill every open space with another task, another obligation, another objective. And when the door closed behind her, he remained seated for a moment longer, the silence settling in a way that no longer felt like something to escape. And he stood, moving toward the window once again, his reflection meeting him there, unchanged in form, but altered in perception. And he studied it briefly, not with judgment, not with pride, just recognition, because the man he saw now was not just defined by what he had built, but by what he had missed. And that understanding did not weaken him, it expanded him. And he turned away from the window, his steps measured as he moved toward the door, leaving the office behind without hesitation, because the work of the day was complete, and what remained was not something that could be addressed within those walls. And across the city, Ava moved through her evening with the same steady rhythm, dinner prepared, homework reviewed, her son's laughter filling the space in small, consistent bursts. And when the night settled in, she guided him toward bed, his energy fading into quiet as sleep approached. "Will we do the same thing tomorrow?" he asked, his voice soft, and she smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "we will." And he nodded, content with that answer, because in his world, consistency was not boring, it was safe. It was certain, and as she turned off the light and stepped out, closing the door softly behind her, she did not carry the past with her. She did not revisit the conversation, because it had already been placed where it belonged, and her life continued forward, steady, intentional, unaffected by anything that did not align with what she had chosen to build. And in another part of the city, Ethan stepped out into the evening air, the skyline behind him, the street ahead, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to direct where he was going next. He simply moved forward, not without purpose, but without the assumption that he controlled every outcome, and that shift, though quiet, marked the beginning of something he had never had to consider before, not how to reclaim what was lost, but how to respect what had been built without him. Time did not slow down after that day. It continued, steady and indifferent, but something within it had shifted its meaning, not for her, not for the life she had already built with clarity and intention, but for him, because for the first time, time was no longer something he could structure entirely around his own decisions. It was something that had already carried forward without him, and now he was learning how to exist within it instead of directing it, and the days that followed did not bring dramatic changes. They brought quiet adjustments, the kind that did not announce themselves but became evident in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he paused before making certain decisions. And in his office, the routine continued, meetings scheduled, deals negotiated, strategies executed with the same level of precision that had defined his success. But there was a new layer beneath it, a question that lingered not as a distraction, but as a filter, asking not what could be gained, but what truly mattered beyond the transaction. And he found himself declining certain opportunities he would have pursued without hesitation before, not because they were unprofitable, but because they no longer aligned with something he had only just begun to understand. And his assistant noticed the shift, not in words, but in patterns, the way his schedule began to include spaces that were not immediately filled, the way he left the office earlier than usual on certain days, not often, not enough to disrupt his work, but enough to suggest that his priorities were no longer confined to the walls of that building. And one afternoon, as he stood once again by the window, the city stretching out in its familiar complexity, his phone buzzed softly in his hand, a notification that did not demand urgency, but caught his attention nonetheless, a public update, a photo. Ava standing beside her son at a small community event, not a gala, not a press conference, just a local gathering. Her presence there not for recognition, but for contribution, and he studied the image for a moment longer than necessary, not because of what it showed, but because of what it confirmed, that her life was not built around being seen, it was built around being present, and that distinction settled deeper than anything else he had learned so far. And he lowered the phone slowly, his gaze returning to the city, but this time, he did not see it as a collection of opportunities. He saw it as a network of lives moving independently, intersecting without needing to be controlled. And across town, Ava moved through that same city in a different rhythm, her day structured not by volume, but by intention, meetings that aligned with her work, conversations that moved things forward, and in between them, moments that remained untouched by external pressure. The quiet walk from her office to her car, the brief pause before picking up her son, the space she allowed herself to exist without performance. And when she arrived at his school, he ran toward her as he always did, his energy unchanged, his trust unwavering, and she met him with the same steady presence. Because nothing about her life required adjustment after that conversation, nothing about her foundation had shifted, and as they walked together, his voice filled the air with simple questions. "Can we stop for ice cream?" he asked, and she considered it for a second before nodding. "Just one scoop," she said, and he smiled, satisfied with the balance. And they turned slightly off their usual path, the small shop ahead warm with light and the soft hum of conversation, and inside, the moment remained simple, ordinary, the kind that did not need to be remembered to matter, because it was already part of something larger, something consistent. And miles away, Ethan left his office earlier than usual that same day, not with a specific destination, not with a scheduled obligation, but with a quiet intention to step outside the structure he had always relied on. And as he walked through the city, the noise and movement surrounding him, he did not stand apart from it as he usually did. He moved within it, observing without directing, present without needing to be recognized. And he passed by places he had never paid attention to before. Small businesses, local gatherings, spaces that existed without his influence. And for the first time, he noticed them, not as insignificant, but as complete in their own right. And he stopped briefly at a corner, watching as people crossed, conversations overlapping, lives intersecting in ways that did not require his involvement. And he realized that the world did not revolve around control. It expanded through connection, and that understanding did not diminish his position, it redefined it. And as evening settled in, he returned to his car, the city lights beginning to reflect against the glass. And when he arrived home, the silence of the space greeted him differently than it had before, not empty, not lacking, but open. And he stood there for a moment, not moving immediately, allowing the quiet to exist without needing to fill it. And across the city, Ava tucked her son into bed once again, the same routine, the same gentle certainty, his small voice asking one last question. Before sleep, "Are you proud of me?" And she smiled, brushing her hand lightly over his hair. "Always," she said. And he closed his eyes with that answer settling into him. And as she stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, she paused for a brief second in the hallway, not reflecting, not reconsidering, just existing in the space she had built. And then she moved forward, because that was what her life had always been, not a reaction to what had been lost, but a continuation of what she had chosen to create. And in another part of the city, Ethan stood in the quiet of his home, understanding that some realizations did not come with immediate action. They came with a shift in perspective, and that shift, though subtle, had already begun to change the way he moved through everything else. There was no single moment where everything changed, no dramatic shift that marked a before and after. Instead, it happened quietly, in the way space was held, in the way distance remained unbroken, in the way two lives continued forward without attempting to merge. And for Ethan, that realization settled deeper with each passing day, not as something he resisted, but as something he began to understand with a clarity that did not require explanation. And the world around him continued to operate as it always had. Meetings filled his calendar, decisions shaped outcomes. His name carried weight in rooms that depended on it. But there was a difference now in how he carried that weight, not as something that defined him entirely, but as something that existed alongside a truth he could no longer ignore. And one afternoon, as he sat in a conference room reviewing a proposal, his attention did not drift away from the conversation. It remained present, but beneath it, there was a quiet awareness, a recognition that the life he had once believed to be complete had always been missing something he had not valued at the time. And when the meeting ended, and the room emptied, he remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the table, his gaze lowered, not in thought, but in acknowledgement, because some understandings did not require analysis, they required acceptance. And across the city, Ava's life moved forward with the same steady rhythm, her days structured by intention, her time divided between her work and her son in a way that never felt like compromise, because she had built it that way. And as she stood in her office reviewing a set of plans, her assistant stepped in briefly, updating her on a new opportunity, a larger project, one that would expand her company's reach. And Ava listened, asking a few precise questions before nodding. "We will take it," she said, her voice calm, assured, and the decision was not driven by ambition alone. It was aligned with the direction she had already chosen. And when the assistant left, Ava remained where she was, her gaze returning to the plans in front of her, because progress for her was not measured in sudden leaps. It was measured in consistency, in the quiet accumulation of decisions that built something lasting. And later that day, as she picked up her son, his energy carried the same warmth it always did, his hands slipping into hers as they walked. "We have a project tomorrow," he said, his voice bright. "I have to build something." And she smiled slightly. "What are you going to build?" she asked, and he thought for a second, his brows pulling together in concentration. "Something strong," he said, and she nodded. "Then we will make sure it stands." and he grinned, satisfied with that answer, because in his world, strength was not something complicated. It was something that held, something that stayed. And as they continued walking, the city around them moved in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet stability that existed between them. And miles away, Ethan found himself once again stepping outside his usual path, not because he had a destination, but because he had begun to understand that not everything needed to be directed. And as he walked through the city, he passed a small park, something he would have overlooked before, but this time he slowed slightly, his gaze shifting toward the open space, where families gathered, children played, conversations unfolded without urgency, and he stood there for a moment, not intruding, not stepping closer, just observing, because there was something in that simplicity that he had not allowed himself to notice before, and it did not feel foreign, it felt grounding. And he remained there just long enough to understand that presence was not about control. It was about being there, fully, without distraction, without expectation, and then he moved on, not because the moment ended, but because it had already given him what he needed to see. And as evening settled in, Ava's home carried the same quiet warmth it always did. Dinner prepared, conversation shared, her son's voice filling the space with small details from his day. And when it was time for bed, the routine unfolded with the same gentle consistency. "Did I do good today?" he asked, his voice softer now, and she looked at him, her expression steady. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," she said, and he nodded, content with that, because he did not need more than that. He needed truth, and she always gave him that. And as she turned off the light and stepped out, closing the door softly behind her, she did not pause, did not reflect, because her life did not require revisiting. It required continuing. And in another part of the city, Ethan stood in his home, the quiet surrounding him in a way that no longer felt empty. And he moved through the space without distraction, his steps measured, his presence grounded, and he stopped briefly by the window, the city lights stretching out before him, not as something to conquer, but as something to witness. And for the first time, he understood that some things were not meant to be regained. They were meant to be respected from where they stood. And that understanding did not come with regret. It came with clarity, because what he had lost was not something that could be taken back. It was something that had already been transformed into something stronger, something complete, something that no longer required him to exist. And that truth, though quiet, settled into place with a finality that did not need to be questioned. The story did not end with a reunion. It did not circle back to what could have been. It moved forward, exactly as it was meant to. And in that movement, everything found its place, not in each other, but within themselves, and the city continued to breathe around them, unchanged, steady, indifferent to the quiet shifts that had taken place within two lives that once crossed paths, and then diverged in ways neither of them had fully understood at the time. And for Ava, nothing about her days required adjustment. Nothing needed to be revisited or redefined, because she had already done that work long before anyone else had noticed. And her life continued with the same intentional rhythm, her mornings grounded, her work purposeful, her evenings centered around the one thing that had never been uncertain. And as she stood once again outside her son's school, the familiar scene unfolding, children stepping out, voices filling the air, she did not look for anything beyond what she had come for. And when he ran toward her, his hand reaching for hers with the same trust that had always been there, she met him with the same steady presence. Because consistency had never been something she performed, it was something she lived. And as they walked together, his voice carried the same quiet curiosity. "Can I show you what I built today?" he asked, holding up a small structure made from classroom materials, uneven but standing, and she crouched slightly to look at it, her expression attentive. "It is strong," she said, and he smiled, because that was what he had aimed for. Not perfection, just strength. And they continued walking, the moment simple, complete, needing nothing more. And across the city, Ethan's days had settled into a different kind of clarity, not less structured, not less focused, but more aware. And as he stood in his office, reviewing another set of decisions, another set of outcomes, he did not approach them with the same singular perspective he once had. He saw them within a broader context, one that included not just results, but impact, not just growth, but meaning. And that shift did not slow him down. It refined him. And when the day ended, and the office emptied, and the quiet returned, he no longer filled it immediately. He allowed it to exist, because he understood now that not every space needed to be occupied. Some needed to be respected. And as he stood by the window, the city lights stretching out before him, he did not see what he had lost. He saw what had been built without him. And for the first time, that understanding did not carry regret. It carried respect, because what she had created was not something he could have shaped. It was something that had grown from a place he had never taken the time to understand. And that truth, though quiet, was complete, and miles away, Ava's evening settled into its familiar rhythm. Dinner shared, laughter woven into small moments, her son's voice carrying the same steady warmth that defined their life together. And when it was time for bed, the routine unfolded as it always did. The light dimmed, the room quiet, his small voice asking one last question before sleep. "Are we going to do this again tomorrow?" And she smiled gently, brushing her hand lightly over his hair. "We always do," she said, and he nodded, his eyes closing, with that certainty resting easily within him. And as she stepped out, closing the door softly behind her, she paused for just a moment in the hallway, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge the life she had built, not as something extraordinary, but as something true, something that did not need validation, because it already stood on its own. And she moved forward, because that was what she had always done, not looking back, not waiting for what could have been, but continuing with what was. And in another part of the city, Ethan turned away from the window, the reflection of the skyline fading behind him, and he did not carry the past with him as he moved. He carried the understanding it had given him, the recognition of what mattered beyond control, beyond success, beyond the metrics he had once measured everything by. And as he stepped out into the evening, the city opening around him, he did not try to define his place within it. He allowed it to exist, knowing that not every story needed to intersect again to have meaning. And somewhere within that understanding, there was a quiet finality, not an ending, but a completion, the kind that did not close doors, but clarified them. And as the night settled in, and both lives continued forward, separate, steady, whole, the truth remained simple. Some people are not meant to return. They are meant to remind you of who you were, so you can finally understand who you have become.